I'd like now to introduce Professor Harriet Ward from Loughborough University. Harriet will be known, I'm sure, to a number of you as a rather prolific researcher also in social care. Harriet is Director for the Centre for Child and Family Research at Loughborough University, and she's also the co-director for a government-funded child wellbeing research centre that's a partnership between the University of London, Loughborough University, and the Institute for Education. Not sure who's got their mobile turned on. Hope it's not me. And as I said, Harriet is a very prolific researcher. She's got over 20 years' experience as a research director and field researcher, probably best known for all the work that she's done over many years, both in this country and abroad in relation to looked after children, but has a number of different projects which she's undertaken, and was the co-author of the Messages from Research overview summary, which pulled together all the findings from the DFE-DH research initiative. So Harriet.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to come and talk to you about really the findings from this overview. You've already seen this slide. Snap, Jenny and I have exactly the same one. I'm going to be talking really about the findings from the Safeguarding Children Research Initiative. It looks like this. And as Jenny has already said, this was a Department of Health, Department for Education funded research initiative that was introduced following the death of Victoria Climbié. About halfway through, when most of the research studies were coming to an end, I think, Peter Connolly died, and the researchers were asked to also explore some of the issues surrounding his death, many of which were similar to those surrounding Victoria Climbié. There were 15 studies commissioned, and 15 studies included in the overview. They were commissioned over that period of time, and they focused on themes that were evident, particularly related to Victoria Climbié's death: identification and initial response to abuse and neglect. Why is it so hard to identify neglect, and why is response so often delayed? That's really what I'm going to be talking about now. But the studies also looked at effective interventions and interagency and interdisciplinary working, and running throughout them all was a focus on neglect and emotional abuse. Just to say something about how it's disseminated, you can actually get this publication free. You can download it from the internet. You can if you Google Safeguarding Children Research Initiative, that gives you all the information about, it gives you a free download of this and information about how to access all the other studies. And I don't think it's very well known that there are also separate briefing papers for professionals from a whole range of different disciplines. So if you don't have time to look at the whole thing, there are key points for people for many different disciplines. I'm also going to say something about one of the studies in the initiative, Safeguarding Babies and Very Young Children from Abuse and Neglect, partly because this is the study that I directed myself, and as anybody who's heard me speak before will know that I am probably too emotionally attached to this study. It's the most interesting study I have ever done in 20-odd years. These babies were all identified before their first birthdays as likely to suffer significant harm. Almost 2/3 of them before they were born. We followed 43 of them until they were 3, 37 of them until they were 5, and we just heard last week we have funding to have another look at them now they're age 6 or 7. We've got a range of data from a vast number of sources, but I think the key point for today is that children such as these and the empirical studies in the whole research initiative, but maybe specifically this study because it has such a wealth of data, can concentrate on a very small number of children, throws into really sharp relief some of the much wider findings from the whole range of research. So, for instance, we know that neglect has a major impact on the long-term development of children, particularly when it happens in the very early years. 40 of the children, I think, in this study experienced long-term chronic neglect, and that has had a major impact on their lives, and we can see it now playing out in their lives. We can see it, those children who were not adequately safeguarded, about a third of them, we can see that they are now developing quite substantial emotional and behavioural difficulties, and that really throws into sharp relief what we know from a whole range of other studies. I thought perhaps it might be a good idea to know what we're all talking about when we're talking about neglect. It is an incredibly slippery subject, isn't it? Very, very hard to understand what you're looking at because it is so wide and difficult to define. And maybe one of the first things to say is that, as Jenny has already indicated, everybody neglects their children at one time or another. When my youngest child was 2 weeks old, we had to move house. We had to move as soon after he was born as possible, and when he was 2 weeks old, we went to look around a house that we were thinking of buying. We knocked on the door, he was asleep in his carry cot, we put him in the front room, we walked round the house, we had a look at it, we decided it wasn't for us, we said goodbye to the owners, we got into the car, we drove away, and suddenly someone said, "Surely we were carrying something when we came in here?" Everybody, well, not everyone has done that, but most parents have done something like that. The momentary inattention, taking your eye off the ball. But chronic, persistent neglect is the issue that is of real significance. Neglect that continues and that has a long-term impact on early childhood and later development. And it is defined as the persistent failure to meet the child's needs, likely to result in serious impairment, failure to provide adequate food, protect a child, ensure adequate supervision, ensure access to appropriate medical care, and neglect of or unresponsiveness to a child's basic emotional needs. What are the obstacles to recognising and responding to this specific issue? These are the obstacles that I shall be looking at. There's inadequate dissemination of the potential impact of risk factors. That came out very, very strongly from a number of studies in the research initiative. Another factor that came out very strongly was that there's insufficient understanding, particularly I think in the social care workforce, of the potential impact of neglect. Rather too long ago to go into, when I was training as a social worker, I don't think the word neglect was ever mentioned. It wasn't something that mattered. It certainly wasn't something that was considered important. It was just the situation in which many families lived. We know much more now about its potential impact. Insufficient understanding of children's time frames, how really in the early years particularly action needs to be taken early and decisively. Reluctance to refer and high threshold is another obstacle. Once neglect has been identified, there is a delay in responding, and that's something to do often with reluctance to refer and reluctance to accept referrals. And then taking action. Many children are not placed in the care system because there are misperceptions of the outcomes of care. We tend to think that care is very damaging. The studies in the research initiative tended to refute that. And throughout, I think, there is a difficulty in focusing on the child. We all know that the child's needs are the primary consideration, the paramount consideration, but focusing on that appears to be extremely difficult for all professionals involved. So, potential impact of risk factors. This is the sort of information that the studies in the initiative suggested is not adequately disseminated or known. I don't know how many of you are aware of the work that Heidi Cleaver and colleagues have done on parental problems, substance abuse, mental health issues and domestic violence, and their impact on children and how they tend to impact on parental capacity. If you're not aware of that, go and hunt it out. It's an extremely valuable publication. You can dip in and out of it, and it shows you exactly how it is that parents who have, for instance, substance misuse issues find it difficult to meet a child's basic needs, how they find it difficult to be available to the child, how they can't always protect the child, and how that tends to lead to issues concerning abuse and neglect. That's very valuable, worth knowing, not adequately disseminated. There are concerns about severe learning disability. Parents with severe learning disability are capable of providing nurturing homes for their children, but things get more and more difficult, particularly when domestic violence, substance misuse, and mental health problems are also present within the family. They also need long-term support, and long-term support is often not available. Some children are particularly likely to be abused and neglected, something that we do not want as a society to confront, particularly the abuse of disabled children. Very, very hard to accept that this actually happens. But in fact, children with disabilities are 3.5 times as likely as their peers to experience abuse or neglect, and there are reasons for that. Sometimes the disabilities are, of course, caused by abuse or neglect. Sometimes they're caused by parents' difficulties in coping with the situation. And new evidence from 2 of the studies in the research initiative, and verified by other studies now, is that there is a relationship between criminal convictions for violent offences and maltreatment. Stands to reason, really, doesn't it? But somehow it's taken us a while to work this one out. But adults people who are violent within the community are, unsurprisingly, likely to be violent within their own homes as well. The other area that isn't well understood, particularly I think in the social care workforce, is how children develop the intimate relationship between the attachment relationship and early childhood development, and how that impacts on the child's intellectual, emotional and social development in the key areas that then form the building blocks for further growth. I'm not going to go into this in any detail at all. I know Jane Barlow will be talking much more about this afternoon. But these issues aren't adequately understood by the social care workforce, and the impact of maltreatment when children are not adequately nurtured is not sufficiently understood. We now know, for instance, that substance misuse, alcohol misuse, and indeed domestic violence during the pregnancy can affect the fetus and cause long-term damage. Not always understood. Some of the case papers that we looked at in the longitudinal study of babies, for instance, the assessment of the child's development in an unborn child simply said this child isn't born, there are no developmental issues. Well, there are developmental issues if the parent is substance misusing throughout the pregnancy, for instance. It's not widely understood, I think, that the child will adapt as readily to negative as to positive experience, and the process of attachment begins before birth. Again, something that Jane Barlow, I think, will be mentioning. But the issue is really that as attachment progresses and becomes more entrenched, attachments that are insecure in various ways will have a long-term impact unless things can be turned around. We now know, for instance, that frightened or frightening parental behaviour is associated with disorganised attachment at 12 to 18 months. Up to 80% of neglected and abused children develop disorganised attachments. That's related to later psychopathology in a whole range of areas. And we know, because these things happen in the very early years, that if children are to be separated permanently, they need to be separated early. These decisions have to be made early. And there is evidence, for instance, that babies placed for adoption before their first birthdays are more likely to become securely attached to carers than those who are placed later. This doesn't mean, of course, that thousands and thousands of children need to be placed for adoption. It means that if parents don't have the capacity to change, don't have the capacity to nurture their children, that needs to be understood early and picked up early, and appropriate action needs to be taken, supporting the parent, providing help, providing intensive interventions, and if they're not helpful, then placing the child away. And as we know, maltreatment has a huge impact on later life. So neglect and emotional abuse often manifest themselves early, and they have a corrosive impact throughout childhood. Consequences particularly severe in utero. Impact on small babies very often not appreciated. There's a potential for long-term consequences throughout the lifespan, but one of the problems is, because neglect can be long-term corrosive but not very high profile, things very rarely happen unless a crisis occurs. Children in our sample, those who were severely neglected, the only time that action was precipitately taken, or taken at all in some cases, was if there was a crisis. If the baby was locked up alone in the house overnight and the police were called, something happened. But if the baby was not fed or changed or was not adequately stimulated for months and months on end, nothing happened. There's new evidence about adolescence, and Mike's going to talk about that. How can we deal with these things? Well, there is evidence from a range of studies in the research initiative about training, about social care training, for instance. From our study, it's clear that the workforce isn't sufficiently trained in childhood development and the impact of abuse and neglect. It's not sufficient, people are not sufficiently trained about risk and protective factors for abuse. And because people aren't adequately trained, it's very hard to recognise neglect particularly. And because it's hard to recognise, interventions are often indecisive and delayed. All the empirical studies in the programme identified numerous children left for too long in very damaging situations without adequate action being taken. And we think it's partly because the long-term impact of some of those situations wasn't adequately recognised. And delays have consequences, particularly when children are very young and when their development is advancing fast. Well, the studies showed a number of indicators that need to be recognised in order to identify neglect. And here is a list of what was picked up by the studies. Some of them are touched on, of course, by Ruth's work, and I suppose I'm looking at the fine detail while Ruth was looking at a much broader picture. Persistent failure to attend routine appointments, for instance, failure to seek help following injuries, sudden weight loss in children, not always picked up as an indicator of neglect. There's a lovely study from, I think it was the Netherlands, showing that school nurses are often the first person to whom children will signal maltreatment. So knowing who is the first port of call is very important, because if you're the person who the child is most likely to approach, you need to know what to do next. Indicators of the sort of children, of the factors that children are likely to display when they're suffering long-term neglect, whether they're withdrawn and unpopular children are, as Ruth has said, often victimised, and they're also often neglected. Manifestations within the child, such as delays in language and communication, and so on and so forth. You could go on drawing up lists of indicators until the cows come home. And one of the problems is that although you probably need to know what are the factors that are really significant and what you need to know about, you're never going to have a checklist that will be sufficiently comprehensive to replace judgment. You mustn't replace professional judgment with a checklist. It's an aid to judgment, not a replacement for judgment. And one of the things that I think is rarely noted and that comes out really strongly in our study, but I think also in Elaine Farmer's work, is that as children grow older, the focus changes to another child in the family. So when a new baby is born, we forget about the toddler, we focus on the new baby, and that toddler may go on experiencing long-term chronic neglect, abuse in other areas, but it's ignored because of the baby. And that happens not only in families, but our study is showing also that it happens within the school. When you're no longer in the reception class, there is a new reception class to focus on, and you're no longer considered such a focus for attention. So there are real concerns about what happens as children grow older. And then, as Mike will be saying, as they become adolescent, again, that process of neglecting children as they're considered to be old enough to cope for themselves continues. Neglect by services as well as by families. So what are the obstacles to referring once the consequences of neglect, the risk factors have been adequately understood and appreciated, people are aware of the indicators, what then are the problems? And it's clear from some of the data that Ruth was presenting that even when these factors are identified, referrals don't in any way match up to the prevalence of neglect and abuse. We found some of the qualitative studies in the initiative looked at adult services, and our study did that too, and they find that adult services, adult domestic violence, substance misuse, mental health services rarely refer children to children's social care. Of the 57 children in our sample, almost all of whom were living in families where domestic violence, mental health problems, or alcohol or substance misuse were evident, usually in combination. Of those 57 children, one child was referred by substance misuse services, no child was referred by mental health services, no child was referred by domestic violence services. And there are reasons for that. There are conflicts between staff working in adult services who are focusing often on the parent and staff working in children's services who focus on the child. There are cases in our study, for instance, where the social worker and the substance misuse worker were at loggerheads, and the substance misuse worker in one of our cases was deliberately hiding evidence of continued substance misuse from the social worker because they were concerned that when court proceedings took place, the parent would lose the care of the child. There is a lot of work to be done in trying to engage better discussion between people who focus on parents and people who focus on children. There is evidence from the range of studies in the initiative suggesting that particularly staff working in adult services are the least likely to attend local Safeguarding Children Board joint training, and that's one of the issues that needs to be addressed. There are differences in thresholds. Everybody has different thresholds, and trying to align them are virtually impossible. The people who have the lowest threshold, who think that more families ought to be referred to children's services, are parents, or even children. We did a study where we spoke to children, and they thought we'd looked at indicators of neglect and abuse with children, and they said all these children ought to be taken into care immediately. So the less professional you are, the lower your threshold. That's one of the reasons why we have such a massive response when a child dies, of course. There are concerns about inappropriate or inadequate responses, again touching on what Ruth said about general practitioners. There is a study in the initiative that looked at GPs, and one of the reasons they didn't refer is, as Ruth says, they support the family for years and years, and they know that social care will only support them for a short time. But also they are confused about who is their real, who should they be providing support to when the interests of the child are perhaps at odds with those of the parent, when there is suspected abuse and neglect, and they're concerned that social services will either take too intensive action and take very decisive, intrusive action when it's not necessary, or else will take inadequate action. We spoke to school teachers too, and they have similar concerns. Non-existent feedback from children's social care is a major issue for professionals referring in. It's no point my continuing to refer cases, they never take them up and we never know why. Or we referred the case and we didn't know that the child has now been through 4 foster homes and nobody knows their address. The school said that. And there are issues about universal services. We need to strengthen our universal services. Again, this issue comes from Sweden, but it's obvious, I think, from the studies in the initiative too. these are the people who are most likely to identify abuse and neglect in its early stages. It's not the people who are working in children's social care. It's the people who are likely to refer children to children's social care, who are in a position to refer, but who also see a much broader section of the population, and therefore for whom children who are being neglected stand out, who can see what is different. Because if you work exclusively with abused and neglected children, particularly neglected children, you become desensitized to some of the evidence. There are all sorts of issues about identifying who can safely remain at home, but I'm mindful of the time. I can see a 5-minute warning being flashed up, so I'm not going to go into that, except to say that a Lane Farmer's study found that 40% of parents may resist or sabotage professional interventions. We need to know which parents are able to change very adverse lifestyles within a child's time frame. Some parents who are not ready or able to change at one point in time may develop that readiness and capacity at a later stage. That's evident from our study. But the issue is to do with the child's time frame. You cannot hold on, you cannot put a stop to a child's development while you are hoping that the parent is going to learn how to look after them and to nurture them adequately. So the outcomes of care, because I think this is a real issue. Any newspaper you pick up, you will see that care is very damaging for children, that outcomes of care are appalling, etc., etc., etc. However, there are 2 studies in the research initiative, the one that Elaine will be talking about, but one also led by Jim Wade at York University, and there have been a number of other studies too, that show that care is not damaging for all children by any means. The outcomes are largely positive for children who are placed for adoption, although long-term support is required for a high proportion of them. The outcomes of care are also positive for children who have been abused and maltreated, and particularly for children who have been neglected. But what the care system doesn't do is able to provide adequate psychotherapeutic support. It's a basic level system that is able to improve on what has gone before for many children, but it isn't able to address the consequences of neglect and abuse, and that, I think, is the area that needs to be focused on in improving the care system. And although a large number of studies show that the outcomes of care are positive and definitely better than the outcomes of remaining with a very abusive family, nevertheless, we haven't really cracked the situation for care leavers. Most studies show that the outcomes for care leavers are still not really adequately supported. But the Wade study, for instance, and it's a very well-designed study, showed that maltreated children who remained looked after were less likely to have misused alcohol or drugs, have committed offences, or be in pupil referral units, and more likely to have close adult ties, have a range of special skills, better mean scores for health 5 years after admission than those who remained at home. And it's a good study. It was methodologically very sound. Throughout, there's this difficulty in focusing on the child, which we could maybe discuss at a later date, but I think the real issue is you're trying to keep the family together. How do you identify the impact that the family has if it is an adverse impact on the child? How do you focus on a child rather than the whole family? A lot of misperceptions from the qualitative research about whether the role of the social care workforce is to preserve the family or the individual children within it. And the legislation would suggest the individual children is what needs to be focused on and isn't adequately. So finally, just to draw this to a close, we need to understand better the impact of maltreatment on children's development. We need to understand the importance of early identification of neglect and decisive action to prevent the consequences of neglect right from the start, from pre-birth, when children are being neglected through substance misuse during the pregnancy, for instance. There need to be precise and timely assessments of the potential of the family, the potential of parents to turn their lives around if their lifestyles are very damaging to their children. Those assessments need to be undertaken pre-birth, and we're working with the NSPCC looking at that, and certainly within the first 6 months after the birth. Services need to be provided for families for as long as required. Ruth said something about the very short duration of children's social care. Very evident in our study. Child protection plans for tiny children, the average was 26 weeks. These are very small children in very damaging situations. We need to keep older adolescents in mind, and we need to be aware that care is not a disaster. It is not a damaging situation for children. It has the potential to provide a better surroundings and better support for many maltreated children, hopefully working alongside families so that children can eventually return home if parents have been able to overcome the difficulties that have caused the admission in the first place. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Harriet, for bringing alive the findings from the research study. And it's really interesting as Harriet goes through to see that the consistency of message in terms of Ruth's earlier presentation from a healthcare perspective, and also I think a trailer for what's to come after the break in terms of Mike Steen's presentation around the neglect of adolescents. So some really consistent messages that we're beginning to build up as we move through the day. Just like to say we've got time for one question before coffee. If somebody would like to put out their hand. Right at the back.
I just wanted to ask a question about the voice of the child in all this. You mentioned the Netherlands study, and you indicate that school nurses being a good source for children to signal their maltreatment. I think one of the problems with neglect, because it's process-driven rather than event-driven, children often don't have something specific to say, like I am being touched where I don't like to be touched, or I am being hit. It's children's, how do we recognize from the child themselves about neglect? And I think also their own experience of this is their life, this is how it is for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be an indicator that is different in neglect and emotional abuse than in other forms of child maltreatment.
Well, I would entirely agree with you. I think this is why both neglect and emotional abuse are so difficult to pick up, because as you say, it's difficult, and as I know Mike is going to say later on about the adolescents, it's very difficult to identify when you're being neglected, and that there are, of course, outward manifestations. In our study, for instance, there are children who are arriving at school not having had anything to eat, but also the children who are arriving at school filthy dirty, whose clothes are washed by the school teachers when they arrive. And it's also evident, I think, not only in manifestations of which can be observed in physical appearance, particularly with smaller children, but also evident in consequences for children's development. So very poor language development, I think, is very clear from our study as one of the factors, and that's known from a number of studies. Poor communication and poor language development, because you haven't had that interaction throughout your life where somebody is talking to you and responding to you in various different ways. So the sort of programs that one might want to introduce, I think, there are both specific programs and then there are complex issues in introducing them. I personally think that a really strong enrichment language and communication program for children identified at an early stage could be very beneficial, because the poor communication and poor language development has a long-term reaction throughout their school years and on and on. So that would be one issue. But the other problem, I think, is that there are a number of schools that are developing specific programs for individual children. We picked that up in some of our studies. but they're not sufficiently integrated with other services, and so you need a multi-pronged approach, I think, to neglect, and to develop something in isolation that doesn't sort of link up with what other professionals are trying to do loses a large part of the benefit. So that would be something that I would be looking at.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Harriet. I want to take the opportunity to give another plug, really, for Harriet and Carolyn's wonderful summary, which did do a sterling job of bringing together a huge wealth of information from all the different research studies. And we're hearing snippets as we go through the day, but there is a lot of very important material in there. One little anecdote. I don't, as somebody who was closely involved in the production of this publication, when I worked in the Department for Education, I don't often see people reading it in any capacity whatsoever, so I never lose an opportunity to plug it. But I was on the bus once at Pimlico, and this man was standing there with his finger sort of part way through, so it was clear at least he'd read, at least half of it. And the Antipodes inside of me wanted to go up and say, "Oh, well done." I said, "What do you think of it?" But the sort of civil service side said, I noted it and thought, well, how exciting. I've never seen anybody reading our publications on public transport. So, just to keep me happy, next time I'm on the tube or the bus, I just will be looking out for this in your little hot hands. So thank you, Harriet, for bringing these findings to us again. And we're going to now break for tea, morning coffee, perhaps.